Today, we will discuss about the recent conflict with the rising giant of the world, India. I am with Charlotte here, and today we are going to discuss about this rising geopolitical shift. Welcome you to the new season of World Wave Audio, where we slice through the noise and pull back the curtain on the most complex issues shaping our world.
Today, we're not just talking about tariffs, trade deficits, or, a few percentage points on goods moving across borders. Oh no. We're setting the stage for something far grander and, frankly, far more critical. It's a seemingly bilateral trade dispute that is, in fact, a fundamental test of trust between key global players. A high-stakes gamble in strategic alignment, and, well, a profound force reshaping the very architecture of international relations.
Absolutely. It goes way beyond just the economics.
This isn't just about what's in a shipping container. It's about the future of global power dynamics and, really, the emerging world order.
Indeed. What we're witnessing is a fascinating, if somewhat alarming moment in world politics. It's a moment where economic leverage is being, explicitly used as a foreign policy tool.
Yeah.
Very explicitly. Today, we're diving deep into the escalating tariff dispute between the United States and India, spearheaded by the Trump administration. And like you said, this is far from your typical commercial spat.
Not at all.
It's a complex intersection of aggressive economic measures, a deliberate attempt, it seems, to shift established alliances, and what many in New Delhi see as a direct, almost existential challenge to India's long-held and deeply cherished foreign policy doctrine. That idea of strategic autonomy.
Strategic autonomy.
It truly is a geopolitical crossroads we're looking at.
And to unpack this intricate web, we've pulled from a really rich stack of sources.
Right.
We need to give you the context here.
Yeah, definitely.
We've got incisive expert analyses from powerhouses like the Center for Strategic and International Studies, that's CSIS, the prominent Washington, D.C. think tank focusing on global affairs, and also the Council on Foreign Relations, CFR, another leading U.S. nonprofit think tank specializing in foreign policy. Heavy hitter.
Tier analysis, yeah.
Plus, we're drawing on real-time economic reporting and, importantly, domestic perspectives from leading Indian outlets such as Mint, The Economic Times, and India Today. Getting that view from inside India is crucial.
Critical to understand their reaction, absolutely.
Our mission, as always, is to extract the most important nuggets of knowledge, the surprising facts, perhaps, and the profound implications, giving you, our listener, a shortcut to being well-informed on this complex issue.
Cutting through the noise.
Exactly. We want to reveal how these tariffs are not only reshaping global supply chains, something we hear a lot about, but, more profoundly, the geopolitical landscape itself, setting the stage for what could be a dramatically different international system down the road.
It really could be that significant.
So let's start at the beginning, the immediate crisis. The headlines have been screaming about a dramatic escalation, particularly a new 50% tariff imposed on certain Indian imports. That's a huge number.
It's massive, yeah.
What sparked this? Why now? What's the official U.S. position that has led to such a, sweeping measure?
Okay, so the immediate trigger, the reason stated quite explicitly by the Trump administration, is India's continued purchases of Russian oil. This is post the Ukraine invasion, of course.
Right, the energy angle.
Exactly. From the U.S. perspective, as they frame it, this trade provides a direct lifeline for Moscow. And it directly undermines the international efforts, led largely by the West, to isolate Russia economically, especially given the extensive sanctions regime that's been put in place.
So it's a very direct message.
It's a very pointed message being sent, yeah. Framing India's energy decisions essentially as a direct challenge to what the U.S. sees as a necessary unified Western stance against Russia.
Okay, but is it just about Russian oil? I mean, that feels quite specific for such a broad tariff hitting various sectors, or is there maybe a deeper game at play here, a more intricate strategy beneath the surface?
You're absolutely right to question that, because it's much more complex than just Russian oil, even though that's the stated trigger. While the energy purchases are the immediate justification, these tariffs, it seems quite clear from the analysis, serve a dual purpose. They're functioning very clearly as bargaining chips in long-stalled bilateral trade negotiations between the U.S. and India. These talks haven't gone anywhere fast for years.
The trade talks. That makes sense. Trump's tariff king comments.
Exactly. President Trump has been remarkably consistent in his rhetoric for years, famously labeling India the tariff king. It's a moniker he uses to highlight what he sees as India's high import duties and, protectionist trade policies.
And the trade deficit.
He's often pointed to the hefty U.S. goods trade deficit with India, which stood at a significant $45.8 billion in 2024. Now, this isn't a new grievance.
No, it's been around.
It's a long-standing point of contention for several U.S. administrations, not just this one. But the tariffs, in this light, are being seen as a calculated economic tactic, a form of what some analysts are calling geopolitical arm twisting, really, designed to force India's hand on market access issues that have been stuck.
Like what specifically? Agriculture.
Agriculture and dairy products are primary examples. There have been persistent U.S. demands for India to lower its tariffs in these areas. But these are sectors where India has maintained very firm red lines, largely because they need to protect their politically powerful farming community.
Huge constituency there.
Massive. We're talking over 260 million people. It's critical for domestic stability, food security, and, frankly, electoral success for any Indian government. So while oil is the immediate catalyst, the underlying motivation definitely seems to encompass these broader trade imbalances and market access demands that have vexed U.S.-India relations for years.
Okay, that paints a clearer picture of the U.S. motivations. So with that immense pressure coming from Washington, 50% tariffs aren't exactly subtle. How has New Delhi responded? They can't just roll over, can they? Especially given those domestic political factors.
No, absolutely not. New Delhi's response has been swift and pretty resolute. It really reflects a deep-seated commitment to what they see as their core national interests. India's Ministry of External Affairs officially labeled these tariffs as unfair, unjustified, and unreasonable. Strong language.
Very strong.
And they vowed to take all necessary measures to protect their national interests and their economy. They're digging in.
And the oil purchases. How do they justify those under this pressure?
India vociferously defends its Russian oil purchases simply as a necessity. Their argument is they need to ensure predictable and affordable energy for their 1.4 billion people.
Which is a huge challenge.
It's a massive challenge. You have to remember, after the Ukraine war, global energy markets went haywire. They were significantly disrupted. Many traditional oil suppliers, especially from the Middle East, redirected their exports towards Europe, which was scrambling, desperately trying to reduce its reliance on Russian energy.
Right, leaving India potentially short.
Exactly. Leaving India in a difficult position to secure affordable crude in a super volatile market. So importing discounted Russian oil became, from their perspective, a pragmatic solution, a way to manage their massive energy import bill, which is a huge drain on foreign reserves, and also combat domestic inflation, which affects every single citizen.
This raises an important point then. Is India, in its official response, pointing to any inconsistencies in the U.S. approach? Are they trying to highlight any, let's say, double standards, especially when they're facing such intense targeted pressure?
Oh, absolutely. That's a key part of their public diplomacy and their official statements. India has repeatedly highlighted what it calls a pattern of coercion, selective enforcement, and political hypocrisy coming from the U.S. and its allies.
Strong words again. What examples do they give?
Indian officials are quick to cite data. They point out that both the U.S. and the European Union continue to import certain goods from Russia, even critical ones like uranium, palladium, which is vital for catalytic converters and fertilizers.
Even while criticizing India's oil.
Exactly. And what's particularly striking, from India's viewpoint, is that the EU's total trade with Moscow in 2024, which included continued energy purchases by some member states, was actually significantly more than India's total trade with Russia.
That's a powerful counter-argument.
It's a very powerful argument, and it resonates deeply within India. It allows New Delhi to frame its resistance not just as, an economic dispute over tariffs, but as a principled stand. A stand against perceived double standards and external interference in its sovereign foreign policy decisions. And that position has garnered really broad domestic support, effectively uniting its usually quite diverse political spectrum against this external pressure.
Interesting how external pressure can create internal unity sometimes.
It often does. But perhaps the most profound aspect of India's stance, going back to what we mentioned earlier, is how these tariffs represent a direct, almost existential challenge to its core foreign policy doctrine, strategic autonomy.
Right. Can you unpack that a bit more? Why is it so fundamental for India?
Well, This principle has been a cornerstone of Indian foreign policy basically since independence, but certainly solidified in the post-Cold War era. It replaced its earlier leadership of the non-aligned movement, but the core idea is similar. Strategic autonomy emphasizes India's unwavering ability, or at least its aspiration, to make independent decisions, free from external pressure or the need to align exclusively with any single great power bloc.
So not being forced to choose sides.
Precisely. It's what has enabled India's multi-aligned approach to foreign affairs. It allows them to maintain strong relationships with diverse global powers, the US, Russia, Europe, countries in the Middle East, even engaging within the BRICS bloc without being forced into exclusive camps or, Cold War-style alliances.
And these tariffs directly threaten that.
They're seen as doing exactly that. They're viewed not just as an economic penalty, but as a direct punitive measure for a sovereign decision. India's choice to secure affordable energy for its vast population, a decision made based on national interest. It feels, from New Delhi's perspective, like it's compelling India to choose between a long-standing, historically important partner like Russia.
Which still provides a lot of their military hardware, right?
A huge amount. Over 60% of India's critical military equipment and, crucially, the spare parts to maintain it, still comes from Russia. So that's a vital link. So it's forcing a choice between Russia and its increasingly vital strategic relationship with the US, particularly in the context of balancing China.
What a bind.
It's a terrible bind. And analysts from various think tanks, including CSIS and CFR, are describing the situation using some pretty strong language. A slow-motion catastrophe is one phrase being used. A catastrophe that risks unraveling a quarter-century of hard-won gains in U.S.-India trust, gains that have been painstakingly built over decades through intense diplomatic efforts, growing defense cooperation, intelligence sharing, economic ties, all potentially jeopardized now by this single policy dispute.
Wow. Slow-motion catastrophe. That really frames the stakes. So we've outlined Washington's strategic play, the potential mix of motives, and New Delhi's very principled, autonomy-focused stand. But what are the real-world consequences of this high-stakes game? Let's turn to the immediate economic ripples within India. Numbers often speak louder than words here. What are the tangible economic consequences? How deeply are these impacts being felt?
Well, the projections from economists suggest a significant macroeconomic challenge for India. They're talking about potential reductions in India's FY26 GDP growth, that's the fiscal year starting April 2025, by anywhere from 0.3% to perhaps as much as 0.9%.
That's a noticeable hit to growth for a major economy.
It absolutely is. And that isn't just an abstract number on a spreadsheet. It translates into real impacts on economic activity, on investment decisions, and ultimately on jobs and livelihoods. And this challenge is further compounded by the very real possibility of a higher oil import bill if India is indeed forced by this pressure to seek more expensive alternative crude sources from other markets.
Which would hit their foreign exchange reserves.
Exactly. Such a shift would drain crucial foreign exchange reserves they need for other imports and to stabilize their currency. And it could fuel domestic inflation, hitting the purchasing power of hundreds of millions of Indians.
Which sectors are most exposed? You mentioned exporters.
Yeah, the most vulnerable industries, as you might expect, are India's labor-intensive and manufacturing sectors that rely heavily on exports, specifically to the U.S. market. We're talking about established sectors like gems and jewelry, textiles and apparel, leather goods, footwear, carpets, and pharmaceuticals. These are all major foreign exchange earners and, importantly, major job creators employing millions.
So small businesses could be really hurt.
For many businesses, particularly the smaller and medium-sized enterprises, the SMEs, who operate on much tighter margins and are less diversified geographically, the situation is being described in some reports, anecdotally at least, as potentially worse than COVID.
Worse than COVID, why?
Primarily because of the profound uncertainty. With COVID, there was a sense eventually of light at the end of the tunnel, vaccines, reopening. Here, there's uncertainty about how long this tariffs crisis will last. Will it escalate? Will it be resolved? There's no clear end in sight, making it incredibly difficult to plan or invest.
That's a really grim outlook for those specific sectors and paints a stark picture of vulnerability. But India is a huge dynamic economy. They must be actively working on strategies to mitigate this fallout, right? To cushion the blow. What does that look like on the ground? Are there signs of resilience emerging?
Yes. Despite these significant concerns, you're right. India is not just sitting back. Some industry bodies are indeed putting forward a more optimistic assessment, projecting India's overall resilience. For instance, the PhD Chamber of Commerce and Industry, PhD-CCI, they put out an assessment saying the overall impact on India's total economy might be limited.
Limited? How so?
They project an estimated impact of only about 1.87% on India's total global merchandise exports because the U.S. is just one market, albeit a large one, and a negligible 0.19% impact on India's overall GDP.
Okay, that's a much smaller number than the sector-specific worries. Why the confidence?
Well, this confidence seems to stem from India's broader export base. They don't put all their eggs in the U.S. basket. And also its strong domestic economic fundamentals. India has a huge internal market, which can act as a substantial cushion against external shocks like this. And they've proposed a pretty smart, multi-pronged strategy to mitigate the effects. It seems quite proactive.
What does that strategy involve?
Okay, 4 main prongs. First, they suggest negotiating bundled pricing with major U.S. retailers like Walmart and Amazon, basically leveraging India's scale and importance as a supplier to share the tariff burden or find ways to retain market access despite the higher costs.
Interesting. What else?
Second, developing premium variants of their export products, moving up the value chain, commanding higher prices, targeting niche markets where price sensitivity might be lower. This could improve margins and reduce dependency on sheer volume.
Makes sense. Diversification.
Absolutely. Third, a crucial strategy involves actively redirecting trade volumes, looking for other promising markets like the European Union, Canada, Latin America, places that are also looking to diversify their supply chains away from China, ironically. So there could be opportunities there.
And the fourth?
Finally, encouraging joint ventures for onshore production directly in the U.S. If you make it there, you bypass the tariffs entirely. It's a longer-term play, but potentially effective. So India's diversified economy, coupled with its robust domestic demand, are seen as critical shock absorbers, allowing for this kind of strategic maneuverability.
Can we get a bit more specific on the sectors, though? Even if the overall GDP impact is small, you mentioned significant pain points. What do those numbers look like?
Yeah, it's important to see the detail. To give you a more granular sense of the specific sector exposure and the potential losses, the figures are quite substantial for the affected industries, even if they don't cripple the whole economy. Engineering goods, for example, seem to be facing the largest potential impact, with an estimated $1.8 billion in lost exports to the U.S. market due to the tariff. That's a big hit for that sector.
Oh, $1.8 billion. What else?
That's followed by electronics, potentially losing $1.4 billion in U.S. exports. And pharmaceuticals, a really key sector for India, looking at maybe $986 million in losses, almost $1 billion there.
Wow. Any others? Agriculture related?
Yes. We're also looking at significant estimated losses in areas like fruits and vegetables, potentially losing $31 million from their $331 million export base to the U.S. Meat, dairy, and poultry products could see about a $19 million loss from their $207 million export value. Even something like tea exports might decline by nearly $9 million from a base of around $93 million.
So it adds up across different areas.
It definitely adds up. Other sectors mentioned in the reports that are in the crosshairs include jute manufacturing, tobacco, coffee, oil seeds, cashews. The projected losses are spread across the board for goods hit by the tariff. The cumulative estimated loss across all affected commodities, based on one analysis, stands at about $8.11 billion in exports to the U.S.
$8 billion.
Yeah. So while the overall GDP impact might indeed be cushioned by India's size and diversity, for the actual businesses and, importantly, the workers in these specific export-oriented sectors, the impact is very real and potentially very severe. It's not negligible for them.
No, certainly not negligible for those communities and industries. Okay, that clarifies the impact on India.
Right.
But here's where it gets really interesting, maybe even paradoxical, particularly when thinking about the U.S. and its broader strategic goals. How do these tariffs impact the United States itself, especially given Washington's stated strategy for years now to diversify supply chains away from China? This feels like it could backfire spectacularly.
It absolutely is a profound paradox. You've hit the nail on the head. It's a classic potential example of unintended consequences in foreign policy and trade policy. Analysts across the board are warning that these penalties on Indian imports could directly lead to higher prices for American consumers. Inflation is already a concern, and this could worsen it, hitting household budgets right across the country.
How so? Just more expensive goods.
Primarily because Tariffs on goods like textiles, auto parts, electronic components, chemicals, these aren't just finished consumer goods. Many are crucial inputs for U.S. domestic industries.
Right, parts for things made in the U.S.
Exactly. So tariffs raise costs for American businesses, making them potentially less competitive, and those costs often get passed on to consumers. But the really big picture issue here, the strategic one, relates directly to the much-touted China plus one supply chain diversification strategy.
The idea of not relying so much on China.
Precisely. This strategic approach has been actively pursued by many U.S. and global companies for years now. The goal is to reduce their overwhelming reliance on manufacturing concentrated in China by establishing alternative production hubs elsewhere. And India has been explicitly envisioned by both companies and policymakers as a cornerstone of this diversification, a key plus one to China.
Like Apple moving iPhone production.
Apple is the prime example. They've invested billions in India, significantly expanding their manufacturing footprint there. Their CEO, Tim Cook, even noted recently that the majority of iPhones sold in the U.S. now actually have a country of origin of India. That's a huge shift.
So the tariffs hit those very iPhones.
Potentially, depending on the specifics. But the broader point is the tariffs make these very Indian-made products steeply expensive for American buyers, whether they're finished goods or components. And this puts India at a significant competitive disadvantage compared to its manufacturing rivals like Vietnam, Bangladesh, and ironically compared to China itself, which is not facing similar tariffs on these specific goods in this instance.
So the U.S. is making Chinese goods relatively cheaper than Indian ones.
That's the potential outcome. The profound unintended consequence of punishing India here is that it could inadvertently make U.S. supply chains more, not less, reliant on China. It strengthens Beijing's already formidable position in the global economy by knocking out a key competitor, or at least making it much harder for India to compete in the U.S. market.
Has anyone quantified this risk?
Moody's, the credit rating agency, explicitly warned about this. They said this could stall India's manufacturing momentum, weaken its position in the global supply chain, exactly the opposite of the China plus one goal, and potentially slow India's annual GDP growth by about 0.3 percentage points, which also has ripple effects on global growth prospects.
So it hurts India's rise as a manufacturing alternative, potentially benefiting China. That's quite the strategic own goal, if it plays out that way.
It certainly looks that way from the analysis. And this isn't just about India in isolation. The broader Asia-Pacific, the APAC region, is already seeing really significant dynamic shifts in global supply chains. This is a trend that's been happening for a while, but these tensions accelerate it. Companies are actively relocating production capacity away from China. They're looking at a host of other countries. Vietnam, Indonesia, Thailand, Malaysia are often mentioned, sometimes called the next Asian tigers of manufacturing.
And Chinese companies are doing this too.
Yes. What's even more telling is that even Chinese firms themselves are investing heavily in these Southeast Asian countries. Why? Precisely to bypass U.S. tariffs. They set up shop there, export from Vietnam or Malaysia, and avoid the direct U.S. tariffs on goods made in China. It maintains their global market access.
Lever. So the investment flows show this.
The numbers support it. Vietnam's foreign direct investment, FDI, grew by a robust 5.7% and Singapore's by 10.2% between 2022 and 2023. That signals confidence and new opportunities flowing into those economies. In stark contrast, China's own FDI inflows actually decreased by 9.2% in the same period. That reflects these de-risking strategies and companies shifting investments. And countries like Vietnam are playing it smart too. They're actively diversifying their own trade partners to mitigate their vulnerability to unpredictable U.S. trade policy.
How so?
For example, Vietnam has been increasing imports of U.S. agricultural products and LNG liquefied natural gas, a key energy source. This helps balance the trade relationship. Even though Vietnam still runs a significant trade surplus with the U.S., it hit USD $121 billion in 2024, way up from USD $54 billion back in 2019.
So everyone's adjusting, trying to navigate these choppy waters. Any other examples?
Yeah, other markets are definitely adjusting their trade relationships in this shifting landscape. Australia is a good case. They've really leveraged trade diversification, particularly with India, under their bilateral agreement, the Australia-India Economic Cooperation and Trade Agreement, or ECTA.
How does that help?
Well, this agreement has already made over 85% of Australian goods exports to India tariff-free, and that number is set to rise to 90% by January 2026. Conversely, 96% of imports from India are now tariff-free entering Australia, going up to 100% soon. So it's creating a much more integrated trade relationship between them, partly as a counterweight to dependence on other markets.
And Europe.
The European Union, another major economic bloc, has also significantly increased its engagement with Southeast Asia. EU imports from the ASEAN countries grew by a massive 55.7% in US dollar terms between 2014 and 2024, reaching USD 158 billion. All these movements just underscore this pervasive global reevaluation. Companies and countries are prioritizing supply chain resilience, diversifying partnerships, reacting to escalating trade tensions and geopolitical uncertainties. The world is undoubtedly recalibrating its economic geography right now.
That deep dive into supply chain reorientation really paints a vivid picture. It clearly illustrates how seemingly bilateral tensions, like US-India tariffs, can have these sweeping global consequences, forcing adjustments everywhere. Okay, so if we connect this to the bigger picture, beyond these immediate bilateral trade disputes and supply chain shifts, how does India operate on the broader global stage? Specifically, within critical international institutions like the World Trade Organization, the WTO, this is where the rules of global trade are supposed to be set, negotiated, and enforced. And India seems to play a very unique, sometimes controversial role there.
India presents a truly fascinating contradiction at the WTO. It really does. You could describe it as simultaneously being a norm breaker and at times a crucial deal maker. It wears both hats.
How so?
Well, its influence within the organization has grown considerably over the years. Partly this is due to India's own economic rise, but it's also happened as U.S. power and, frankly, U.S. engagement within the WTO have notably declined, especially regarding its dispute settlement system. This created a vacuum, and India has often stepped into that vacuum, sometimes leading various blocs of developing countries. It has selectively resisted multilateral initiatives when they clash with its perceived defensive interests, but it has also embraced multilateralism when it suits its offensive trade interests.
So it disrupts sometimes.
It has frequently disrupted WTO processes, yes, often to lead coalition of developing countries, carving out a unique space for itself and challenging established norms or propose new rules favored by developed nations. This isn't just about procedural tactics, it's a strategic maneuver that really highlights the evolving power dynamics within these global institutions. Rising powers are increasingly asserting their preferences and shaping the agenda.
Can you give an example of this norm breaking or disruption?
One of the most prominent examples of this strategic approach is India's consistent stance on what are called plurilateral deals.
Plurilaterals. What are those exactly in the WTO context?
Okay, so these are agreements that allow a subset of WTO members, not everyone, to pursue negotiations on specific subjects. Things like e-commerce, services, domestic regulation, investment facilitation. They typically require a critical mass of support, often defined by representing a certain percentage of global trade in that area.
Why did these come about? Why not just negotiate with everyone?
They arose precisely because it became incredibly difficult, almost impossible sometimes, to achieve consensus among all 166 diverse WTO members, especially when trying to negotiate new, often quite ambitious, high-standard trade rules for evolving 21st century issues. The single undertaking approach of the Doha round stalled.
Right. The consensus rule can be paralyzing.
Exactly. So plurilaterals offered a path forward for willing groups of members. Some of these deals create entirely new rules that apply only to the participating members, while others might involve new commitments within existing frameworks. They've become really important components of the WTO's architecture for those who sign on, a way to keep the rule book relevant.
Okay, so a way to make progress despite lack of full consensus. And India consistently objects to these, even when they involve a vast majority of other members, including many developing countries, and when they seem designed to help the WTO address new challenges like digital trade.
Yes, almost consistently. India, often acting in concert with South Africa, has objected to nearly all major plurilateral initiatives. They frequently claim, erroneously, according to most other members and standard legal interpretations of WTO rules, that these plurilaterals are somehow illegal within the WTO framework because they lack full consensus from the start.
What's a key example of this opposition?
A really clear example is India's vehement opposition to the Investment Facilitation for Development Agreement, the IFD agreement.
Investment Facilitation for Development. What does that aim to do?
It aims to improve the transparency of investment measures, streamline administrative procedures for investors, enhance international cooperation, and generally promote good governance in the investment climate. Make it easier and more predictable to invest, especially in developing countries.
And who supports it?
It's supported by a vast majority of WTO members, 125 of them, and critically, most of those are developing and least developed countries themselves. They see it as beneficial for attracting needed FDI.
What are the estimated benefits?
Estimates suggest the IFD could generate global welfare gains somewhere between $250 billion and potentially over $1.1 trillion, with the benefits flowing primarily to poorer countries by making them more attractive destinations for foreign direct investment and making it simpler to do business there.
Seems like a good thing, especially for development. Why does India oppose it so strongly, despite publicly saying it wants more foreign investment?
That's the paradox. India cites a decade-old General Council decision from 2004 as evidence, they claim, that there's no mandate for trade-related investment discussions at the WTO. But, mandates are decided by the WTO membership itself, and they're certainly subject to change as global trade and priorities evolve. Most members believe the IFD initiative is perfectly legitimate.
So India's stance is quite isolated.
On this issue, yes. India largely stands alone, or with only one or two allies, as a norm breaker in opposing the adoption of this widely supported plurilateral. Yet, because of the complex consensus requirements for formally incorporating such deals into the WTO structure, India effectively holds the key to blocking its final adoption. This forces other members, if they want the deal fully integrated, to potentially offer India concessions on other unrelated issues in return for dropping its objections.
So it becomes a bargaining chip for India.
It becomes significant leverage. It's a powerful and often quite frustrating position for the rest of the WTO membership, highlighting the immense influence even a single influential member can wield in a consensus-based system, sometimes to the detriment of widely agreed goals.
That's a really clear explanation of the plurilateral situation. Now, beyond these procedural or structural objections, how does India's deeply rooted position on agriculture, which you mentioned earlier, is a highly sensitive sector globally, but especially for India, how does that affect WTO negotiations? This must be a central recurring challenge.
India's position on agriculture is absolutely a major, long-standing point of contention, and it really reflects its deeply ingrained domestic political and food security priorities. India remains firmly committed to the existing Doha Development Agenda Work Program. That's the negotiation round launched back in 2001, which for decades has been the WTO's core focus, at least rhetorically, on addressing the development needs of poorer countries, particularly in agriculture.
But that round has been stalled for years, right?
Completely stalled, for the most part. And India, often leading a group of developing countries known as the G33, has actively resisted attempts to explore a fundamentally new agenda or inject fresh thinking into the agriculture negotiations. They are wary of any new rules that might constrain their ability to operate their domestic support programs.
And the main reason is food security and farmers.
Unequivocally, their primary stated concern is addressing national food security needs and supporting their massive population of farmers, that politically powerful constituency of 260 million people, roughly 1 in 5 Indians, whose livelihoods are directly tied to agriculture. It's non-negotiable domestically. India's domestic support measures, especially the price support for key staples like rice and wheat through what's called public stockholding for food security purposes, are immense, currently estimated at around $48 billion annually. That's the highest notified support level in the entire WTO.
Can you explain public stockholding briefly?
Sure. It involves the government procuring large stocks of food grains like rice and wheat directly from farmers at predetermined minimum support prices, MSPs, which are often set above market levels. Then the government distributes these food grains to low-income households through its public distribution system at heavily subsidized prices. It serves a dual purpose: supporting farmer incomes and ensuring affordable food access for the poor. It's a vital social safety net and a hugely popular election-winning policy.
Okay, so vital domestically. But how does it impact global trade?
Well, what's particularly striking and often controversial on the global stage is that just 2 countries, China and India, together hold about 2/3 of all global grain stocks, largely due to these kinds of procurement programs. And India is also the world's leading exporter of rice. This raises significant concerns among other agricultural exporting nations like the US, Thailand, Vietnam, that India's substantial subsidies might be inadvertently or perhaps directly supporting its export growth in the rice market.
thereby depressing global prices.
Exactly. Potentially distorting global prices and trade patterns, disadvantaging farmers in other countries who don't receive similar levels of support.
How do WTO rules handle this kind of support?
WTO rules on agriculture are complex. They allow for different categories of domestic support, often color-coded. There's the amber box for the most trade-distorting subsidies, like price supports, which are subject to limits. There's a blue box for subsidies tied to production limits, also somewhat distorting. And the green box for support considered non-distorting or minimally distorting, like funding for research, infrastructure, or environmental programs, which aren't limited. There are also development box flexibilities specifically for developing countries.
Okay, so there are rules and categories.
Yes, the framework exists meant to balance domestic policy space with limiting trade distortion. However, in reality, only a handful of major players, the United States, China, India, Japan, and the European Union, account for nearly 90% of all notified agricultural support globally. The subsidies are highly concentrated.
And where does India fit in terms of compliance?
This is where it gets tricky. India is notable for being the only major member currently notifying that it is in breach of its agreed WTO limits for trade-distorting support, specifically its amber box limits for rice and wheat. Their market price support levels have been calculated at around 87% for rice and between 67–75% for wheat. This vastly exceeds their allowable limit, which is capped at 10% of the value of production for developing countries under the rules.
Oh, way over the limit. How is that allowed?
They are operating under what's called the Peace Clause, an interim agreement reached at the Bali Ministerial Conference in 2013. It essentially shields developing countries' public stockholding programs from legal challenges at the WTO, even if they breach subsidy limits, provided they meet certain transparency and reporting conditions. India is pushing hard to make this temporary peace clause a permanent solution, while many other countries resist that.
So it's a temporary fix that creates ongoing tension.
Precisely. This ongoing breach, even under the peace clause, creates significant frustration among other WTO members and consistently stalls progress in broader agricultural negotiations. It fuels arguments that India is benefiting from special treatment while not adhering to agreed-upon disciplines, making compromise very difficult.
Okay, that clarifies the agriculture complexities.
Okay.
You also mentioned another key area where India objects to reform. Special and differential treatment, or SDT. Can you explain what that is and why India defends it so strongly?
Right. Special and differential treatment, SDT, is another foundational principle of the WTO, woven into many of its agreements. The basic idea is to grant developing country members greater flexibility in implementing WTO commitments.
Flexibility, how?
It can take various forms: longer transition periods to meet obligations, lower levels of commitments, carve-outs from certain rules altogether, and access to technical assistance to help them build their trading capacity and integrate into the global system.
What's the rationale?
The rationale is straightforward: to help integrate diverse economies into the multilateral trading system by recognizing their varying levels of development, capacity constraints, and specific needs. It acknowledges that a one-size-fits-all approach doesn't work.
Sounds reasonable. So what's the problem?
The main problem, and it's a long-standing one, is that the WTO has no objective criteria or definition for what constitutes a developing country. Instead, the system relies on self-declaration. Members simply designate themselves as developing.
So any country can just call itself developing?
Essentially, yes. This leads to a persistent lack of differentiation among the countries claiming developing status. You end up lumping everyone from emerging economic powerhouses like China, India, Brazil, and South Korea into the exact same category as the truly least developed nations, LDCs, in sub-Saharan Africa or small island states, despite vast differences in their economic size, trade volumes, institutional capacity, and ability to compete globally.
So this leads to the accusation you mentioned earlier, that larger, more advanced developing countries might be free-riding, getting benefits intended for much poorer nations.
Precisely. That's the core criticism. This free-riding issue has led to growing frustration among many members, particularly developed countries, but also some developing countries who feel the current system isn't targeted enough. In 2019, this frustration led to a push for reform. A new approach gained significant support, led by the U.S. under the previous administration, but with backing from others advocating for more granular differentiation based on objective criteria.
What kind of criteria?
The U.S. proposal, for instance, suggested that members should graduate from accessing broad SDT benefits if they met certain thresholds, like if they were a member of the OECD, the club of mostly high-income countries, or if they were in the G20 group of major economies, or if they were classified as high-income by the World Bank, or, crucially, if they accounted for a significant share, say 0.5% or more, of global merchandise trade.
How many countries would that affect? Would India qualify?
At the time of the proposal, it was estimated that more than 30 WTO members currently self-designating as developing countries, including major players like India, China, Brazil, South Africa, Turkey, and others, would fall under at least one of these criteria, meaning they would potentially lose some or all of their access to future SDT provisions in new agreements.
And India's reaction?
India strongly objected, leading the charge against this proposal. They argued vehemently that SDT was a treaty-given right enshrined in the original WTO agreements, and that significant development gaps persist within India, like large numbers of poor people, justifying its continued need for these flexibilities across the board.
And what about other developing countries? Were they unified with India?
Not entirely. Ironically, many other smaller developing countries have complained, often behind the scenes, that India, with its significant market presence and negotiating clout, is effectively silencing attempts to create more targeted support. They feel India's broad defense of SDT prevents reforms that could better benefit the truly struggling nations who genuinely need the policy space and assistance the most.
Can you give an example of where this plays out?
The fisheries subsidies negotiations are a stark example. The goal was a comprehensive global agreement to rein in harmful subsidies that lead to overfishing. India was largely seen as responsible for preventing a more ambitious deal. They demanded phase-in periods for reducing their subsidies that were so long decades. In some cases, they would effectively render any commitments meaningless during that time. In the final, much pared-back deal that was eventually reached, focusing only on certain types of harmful subsidies, India quickly declared it a victory, primarily because it preserved subsidies for its own small-scale fishermen, much to the chagrin of environmental groups and other fishing nations worried about collapsing fish stocks.
So, summing up India's WTO strategy, what are the main drivers?
If we look at India's consistent strategy across these three core areas, opposing plurilaterals that might set high standards, staunchly resisting fundamental changes in agriculture talks that could constrain its domestic support, and preserving maximum SDT flexibility for itself, it seems driven by two primary intertwined goals.
Which are?
First, ensuring that any compromises struck in the WTO, especially on new issues, are based on the lowest common denominator. This effectively avoids high-standard rules that might require significant changes to its own domestic practices or regulations. It also helps fend off attempts to bring new global rules into the WTO on sensitive topics like gender equality in trade, climate change measures, or labor standards, areas where India has explicitly opposed formal discussions within the trade body.
And the second goal?
Second, by positioning itself as a leader of the developing country bloc and resisting differentiation, India strategically preserves a very high degree of flexibility for its own domestic policy actions. For example, the levels of trade-distorting domestic support in agriculture that India provides are statistically far beyond what most other developing countries can afford or implement, but the broad SDT arguments help shield these practices.
It sounds like a complex and often adversarial relationship with the WTO system. Is there a way forward? What's the core problem?
Well, a primary problem in getting India, and frankly other major players, to play a more constructive, forward-leaning role in reforming and strengthening the WTO lies partially with the system's chief architect and historically most powerful member, the United States.
How so? The U.S. role.
In recent years, the U.S. itself has, in many instances, demanded additional flexibilities just for itself, like refusing to appoint members to the WTO's appellate body, the Supreme Court for Trade Disputes, effectively crippling the dispute settlement mechanism, which was seen as the jewel in the WTO's crown. And the U.S. has also openly flouted established WTO rules, often unilaterally imposing tariffs or sanctions outside the agreed framework, citing national security exceptions in ways many members view as illegitimate.
So U.S. actions undermine its own credibility to demand reforms from others.
Precisely. To create a fairer, more effective, and more collaborative global trading system and to encourage a more cooperative India, the U.S. itself needs to demonstrate greater consistency in upholding the rules it champions for others. Its leadership needs to be credible. If the U.S. wants progress, it probably needs to engage constructively. Perhaps convince India to drop its blanket objection to plurilaterals by demonstrating their benefits and maybe offering something in return. It needs to push for and participate in a genuine rethink of global domestic agricultural support rules to account for today's market conditions and the diverse needs of the full membership. And it needs to agree to clearer, more equitable distinctions for developing country members, ensuring SDT is targeted effectively based on actual development needs, rather than allowing powerful emerging economies to continue benefiting from broad carve-outs indefinitely. Without consistent U.S. leadership and a willingness to compromise itself, other major members, like India, have very little incentive to fundamentally change their own long-standing strategic approaches within the WTO. It's a deadlock that needs breaking from multiple sides.
That's a really powerful analysis of the WTO's internal dynamics, the U.S. role, and the challenges of global trade governance. It puts a bilateral U.S.-India dispute into a much broader institutional context. Now, what's truly fascinating here, bringing it back to the immediate crisis, is how these bilateral tensions between the U.S. and India ripple out even further, affecting larger strategic alliances. Let's talk about the Quadrilateral Security Dialogue, the Quad. This isn't just a two-player game between Washington and New Delhi, is it? It has much wider geopolitical implications for regional security.
Absolutely not. This is where the seemingly contained trade dispute really takes on global strategic significance. The Quad, comprising the U.S., India, Japan, and Australia, wasn't revived by accident. It was reestablished quite explicitly over the last several years as a strategic grouping, a diplomatic and increasingly security-focused alignment, designed primarily as a bulwark against China's rising influence and its increasingly assertive actions across the Indo-Pacific region.
So its effectiveness depends on unity and trust.
Critically so. The Quad's entire effectiveness hinges on a shared strategic assessment of regional threats, particularly China, and crucially, a robust foundation of mutual trust, cooperation, and increasing interoperability among its 4 democratic members. These U.S. tariffs, by directly targeting and penalizing a core Quad partner like India over a bilateral issue unrelated to the Quad's core mission, risk fundamentally fracturing the Quad. That's the fear analysts express. It risks unraveling years of careful diplomatic work that went into building this stronger partnership, a partnership specifically designed to uphold a free and open Indo-Pacific, a direct counter to China's vision for the region.
How could it push India away?
By compelling India to alter a sovereign decision, particularly one related to its energy security, and reflecting its principle of strategic autonomy through coercive economic measures, it could paradoxically push New Delhi away from Washington. And by extension, potentially away from full-throated engagement with its Quad partners. It might lead India to hedge its bets more, perhaps deepening ties with Moscow, or even finding tactical common ground with Beijing on resisting U.S. pressure. This would be an outcome directly counter to the Quad alliance's fundamental strategic intent of balancing, if not containing, China. It really highlights the delicate balance required in managing alliances with independent-minded partners.
That makes sense. And what about the other 2 Quad members, Japan and Australia? How does this put them in a diplomatic bind? They're caught between their 2 key partners here.
They are placed in a truly precarious, unenviable diplomatic dilemma. As staunch allies of both the United States and India, they find themselves walking a very fine line.
Can they take sides?
It's almost impossible. They cannot openly support the U.S. action, these tariffs, without severely alienating India, a vital partner for their own Indo-Pacific strategies, and thereby jeopardizing the very Quad alliance they are trying to protect and strengthen against China. But conversely, they cannot openly condemn the U.S., their primary security guarantor and most important global ally, without risking significant damage to their own crucial bilateral relationships with Washington. That's unthinkable for Tokyo and Canberra.
So what can they do? Quiet diplomacy.
Their most plausible role is likely behind the scenes, quiet mediation, trying to bridge differences perhaps, urging restraint on both sides, and constantly reinforcing the strategic logic of the Quad, reminding both Washington and New Delhi of the shared long-term goal of countering China that should override this current dispute. It's all about damage control.
Does that work if the U.S. isn't listening?
Well, that's the risk. Their perceived inability to publicly influence the U.S., their main ally, on behalf of another key partner like India, could itself be interpreted externally, particularly by China, as a significant sign of the Quad's underlying fragility, especially when put under stress. It could weaken the alliance's credibility as a truly unified front against China, demonstrating that even within this key grouping, Individual national interests and sometimes unpredictable domestic political pressures in one member state can create deep fissures and undermine collective action. China would certainly look for ways to exploit such divisions.
That highlights the potential damage to the Quad's cohesion. Now let's look at the China angle even more directly.
Yeah.
The strategic calculus behind these U.S. tariffs becomes particularly questionable, almost baffling, when you examine the role of China itself in this equation.
Yes, this is perhaps the most puzzling aspect strategically. The U.S. administration claims its tariffs on India are intended to weaken Russia's economy by reducing its oil exports, thereby pressuring Moscow over the Ukraine war. That's the stated goal. However, as we've touched upon, the U.S. has conspicuously not imposed similar penalties on China. This is despite China being by far the single largest buyer of Russian crude oil globally.
Could we have numbers on that?
Yes. Data cited from June 2025 clearly shows China purchased a staggering 47% of Russia's total crude exports in that period. India came in second at 38%. China's share is significantly larger.
So why no tariffs on China for buying Russian oil?
While President Trump has certainly hinted at potential future tariffs for China over various issues, including possibly its Russia ties, he has not acted on this front. One advisor was quoted anonymously noting that the U.S. simply does not want to get to a point where we hurt ourselves economically by imposing massive tariffs on its largest trading partner, China, given the deep interdependence and potential inflationary impact.
So it's seen as too costly to target China, but okay to target India.
That appears to be the calculation, yes. This selective targeting of India, while effectively sparing the largest purchaser, China, reveals a glaring inconsistency between the U.S.'s stated objectives regarding Russia and its actual policy implementation. It raises serious questions about the true motivations.
So if India is the one being punished here, are analysts truly saying that China is the one benefiting from this entire situation? It seems counterintuitive if the goal is to counter China long term.
Absolutely. It sounds counterintuitive, but analysts widely agree on this point. The consensus view is that the collateral damage is India, and the undisputed strategic beneficiary is China.
How does China benefit specifically?
Several ways. First, China is spared from these specific tariffs, which immediately gives its exporters a competitive advantage over their Indian rivals in the huge U.S. market, especially for manufactured goods where India was being positioned as that China plus one alternative. This undermines the diversification strategy directly.
Okay, competitive advantage. What else?
Second, Beijing gets to sit back and observe its two primary geopolitical rivals, the United States and India, both of whom it sees as constraints clash publicly. This diverts their attention, resources, and diplomatic energy away from focusing on the broader China challenge. Infighting among its rivals is always good news for Beijing.
And the oil market.
Third, and this is quite direct, as Indian refiners are potentially forced to reduce their Russian oil purchases due to the tariff pressure and the associated risks, the competition for those discounted Russian barrels will diminish significantly. This allows China, as the dominant buyer remaining, to step in and potentially secure even larger discounts on Russian crude. This effectively subsidizes its massive economy with even cheaper energy, thereby further boosting its industrial competitiveness relative to others.
Wow. Cheaper energy for China, courtesy of U.S. tariffs on India.
That's the potential outcome. This whole situation is being called the tariff paradox. It perfectly demonstrates a profound disconnect between the U.S.'s immediate, perhaps domestically driven trade policy and its broader stated geopolitical strategy of competing with and containing Beijing. It seems to effectively undermine its own core long-term objectives and hands a strategic victory, or at least a significant advantage, to its main global rival.
That is a stunning potential consequence.
Yeah.
Okay, this raises another important question that often comes up in these discussions about U.S. sanctions and economic pressure. There's also been significant talk about de-dollarization efforts and the role of the BRICS bloc in relation to these U.S. actions. How does that fit into this complex picture? Are these tariffs partly aimed at discouraging moves away from the dollar?
That's definitely part of the interpretation offered by many analysts, yes. They see these U.S. actions not just as isolated trade measures, but as part of a wider weaponized tariff strategy. They argue it's less about genuinely fixing specific bilateral trade imbalances and perhaps more about enforcing a broader political agenda, particularly concerning the global financial order and the continued dominance of the U.S. dollar.
And the BRICS connection.
A central factor in this context appears to be the Trump administration's explicit hostility toward the BRICS group. That's Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, plus its newer members. And particularly towards any discussions within BRICS, however tentative, about de-dollarization or using alternative currencies for trade.
Has Trump commented on BRICS directly?
Yes, President Trump has explicitly labeled BRICS anti the United States. He views any collective move away from the dollar, even just for bilateral trade settlement, as a direct challenge to American economic dominance and its global financial power, which underpins much of its influence. He even warned, reportedly prior to taking office for a second term, that the U.S. would potentially require BRICS members to pledge they would not create a common BRICS currency, which isn't actually on the table in any serious way, or support any alternative explicitly meant to supplant the dollar.
And threaten tariffs if they didn't comply.
Yes, threatening tariffs of up to 100% for non-compliance with such a pledge. This really highlights the extreme sensitivity in certain Washington circles to any perceived threat, however remote, to the dollar's reserve currency status.
How does India fit into this de-dollarization picture? Are they actively trying to undermine the dollar?
India's position seems more pragmatic than ideological. While India has certainly been a proponent of using local currencies in bilateral trade, where feasible, for example, discussing rupee-ruble mechanisms for oil purchases with Russia or rupee-dirham trade with the UAE, its approach seems primarily focused on facilitating trade, managing currency volatility, and reducing transaction costs. It's not really presented as an overt challenge to the dollar's global role.
Has India clarified this?
Yes. India's foreign minister, Dr. S. Jaishankar, has publicly stated quite clearly that India has no intention of undermining the dollar. He clarified, India has never been for de-dollarization and emphasized that, right now, there is no proposal to have a BRICS currency. This suggests India sees local currency trade as a practical tool, not a systemic challenge to the existing order.
But the tariffs are still seen as a warning.
Nonetheless, the tariffs on India and, notably, similar recent trade pressures or threats against Brazil, another prominent BRICS member, are definitely seen by many international observers as a clear warning shot. A signal to other nations contemplating similar moves to reduce their reliance on the US dollar, even for practical reasons. And adding fuel to the fire, from India's perspective, was Trump's recent high-profile engagement with Pakistan.
India's regional rival.
Exactly. Promising to jointly explore oil reserves with Pakistan, and crucially, offering Pakistan a much more favorable tariff rate, 19% compared to India's 50%, is perceived in New Delhi as a deliberate tactic, using India's regional rival to exert additional pressure and create leverage. This, coupled with some reported off-the-cuff taunts suggesting India could just buy oil from its arch-enemy Pakistan instead of Russia, has been seen as a calculated, almost personal provocation, further depleting the already low reservoir of trust between Washington and New Delhi at this moment.
That adds another layer of regional tension to the mix. Finally, looking beyond BRICS, how do these U.S. tariffs impact the broader Western alliance? Does it create divisions there too?
It certainly has implications for Western cohesion, yes. Indian officials, as we discussed, have been very public in highlighting what they see as the hypocrisy of the European Union regarding its own continued trade with Russia. They keep pointing out that the EU's total trade with Russia in 2024 was significantly more than India's and included strategically important items like energy, piped gas to some countries, LNG, and fertilizers.
Undermining the US-EU moral high ground.
Exactly. This argument serves to undermine the perceived moral authority of both the US and the EU in their criticism of India's energy policy. It creates a narrative of double standards, which can be quite effective in deflecting pressure and potentially creating sympathy or at least understanding from other non-Western nations. It drives a wedge, conceptually at least, in the idea of a unified Western front against Russia or on applying sanctions consistently. And compounding this is the EU's own recent deal with the US.
The deal is that
The EU recently announced it would suspend its own planned retaliatory tariffs on various U.S. goods. This was following a negotiation with President Trump that resulted in the EU accepting a lower but still significant 15% tariff on certain EU exports to the U.S., likely related to ongoing disputes like steel and aluminum tariffs imposed earlier.
So the EU cut its own deal.
Essentially, yes. By reaching this separate agreement, it prevents the formation of a truly unified Western front alongside India and potentially others against these latest U.S. tariffs. The EU secured its own, albeit costly, reprieve, leaving India more isolated and facing the full 50% tariff.
Making the U.S. approach look even more selective.
Absolutely. The U.S.'s selective targeting of India, while sparing China from similar measures related to Russian oil and then negotiating a separate, less punitive deal with the EU, opens the U.S. wide open to charges of hypocrisy and selective enforcement. This fundamentally erodes global trust in the predictability and fairness of U.S. trade policy and leadership, especially among developing nations that the U.S. has been actively trying to court and align with in its broader strategic competition with China. And India's successful deployment so far of the strategic autonomy narrative demonstrates that nations, especially large ones with options, are increasingly able and willing to resist external pressure from great powers, even from the U.S. This contributes to the broader, undeniable trend towards a more explicitly multipolar world, where power is more distributed and less easily dictated by a single hegemon.
Okay, we have covered an incredible amount of ground. So summing it all up, what does this all mean for the future of global relations? We've gone from specific tariff numbers and immediate economic impacts in India through the complexities of global supply chains and the WTO's inner workings to these sweeping geopolitical shifts involving the Quad, China, BRICS, and the Western Alliance itself.
It's a lot to synthesize, for sure. But the key takeaway is that this U.S.-India tariff dispute is far, far more than just a simple trade spat. It's a deeply complex, multi-layered crisis. It's driven by intertwined and sometimes conflicting U.S. foreign policy objectives, punishing Russia, competing with China, demanding market access, mixed with potent domestic political motives in the U.S.
And the impact on India.
For India, it poses a significant, even existential challenge to its core foreign policy doctrine of strategic autonomy. It threatens its economic stability by hitting key export sectors and potentially fueling inflation. And it risks profoundly fracturing the Quad alliance, which both India and the U.S. see as vital for regional stability.
And the biggest irony.
The biggest irony, and perhaps the most critical point, is that these tariffs seem to inadvertently create a massive strategic opening for China. They highlight what looks like a fundamental disconnect between the U.S.'s immediate trade policy actions and its broader, long-term geopolitical strategy of competing with Beijing. It really is a high-stakes gamble with potentially profound, long-lasting effects on world politics, testing the resilience of existing partnerships, and possibly accelerating the shift toward a more contested, multipolar global order.
Given those high stakes, what are the potential ways this could play out? Based on the analyses we've looked at, what are the plausible scenarios for the future, not just for U.S.-India relations, but for world politics more broadly?
Based on the source material, we can sketch out 3 plausible, though quite different scenarios for how this might evolve. Each has distinct and pretty far-reaching implications.
Okay, scenario 1.
Scenario 1 is diplomatic de-escalation. This is perhaps the most optimistic or at least stability-focused outcome. In this scenario, the U.S. and India could use the short window before the tariffs take full effect, or perhaps shortly after they do, to find some kind of face-saving compromise. Maybe India quietly scales back its Russian oil purchases over time, diversifying its energy sources more rapidly, while perhaps offering some concessions in the stalled trade talks. In return, the U.S. could modify, suspend, or lift the tariffs, possibly declaring a partial victory based on India's actions or renewed commitments.
Would that fix the relationship?
It would stabilize the immediate crisis and prevent further deterioration. However, analysts suggest it would still likely leave a significant residue of mistrust. The memory of this coercive economic pressure would linger, highlighting the fragility of the partnership, especially under a highly transactional U.S. administration. India would likely become an even more cautious partner going forward, doubling down internally on its strategic autonomy doctrine. The trust wouldn't be fully restored.
Okay, so de-escalation, but with lingering damage. What's scenario 2?
Scenario 2 is sustained tension and a weakened Quad. This is the outcome if a resolution fails to materialize quickly. If the full 50% tariffs kick in and remain in place for an extended period, this would likely force India into a more significant reorientation of its trade and manufacturing, actively seeking alternatives to the U.S. market. This would cause real economic pain for Indian exporters in the targeted sectors and a substantial loss of market share in one of the world's largest economies.
And the Quad impact.
Critically, the trust among the Quad partners, the U.S., India, Japan, and Australia, would be severely eroded. India would feel alienated and unfairly targeted by its supposed strategic partner. This weakening would severely hamper the Quad's ability to act as a unified, credible, and proactive front against China in the Indo-Pacific. Its collective action potential would be diminished.
And the winner in this scenario?
This scenario represents a clear, undeniable strategic victory for China. Beijing would benefit not only from a weakened and divided Quad, less capable of projecting collective power, but also, as we discussed, from potentially diminished competition in the Russian oil market, allowing it to secure even larger discounts on crude, further boosting its economy relative to India and others. It would be a significant setback for the U.S.'s entire Indo-Pacific strategy.
That sounds like a very negative outcome for U.S. interests. What's the third possibility? Even more drastic.
The third scenario is perhaps the most profound and potentially transformative: geopolitical realignment. This is the long-term risk if the crisis becomes prolonged and deeply damages the foundations of the U.S.-India relationship. A sustained period of hostility and coercion could compel India to fundamentally reconsider its strategic alignment, accelerating a pivot away from the United States.
Towards whom?
New Delhi might choose to significantly deepen its existing ties with Russia, despite current tensions. It might seek more common ground with China on resisting U.S. unilateralism, even while competing regionally. And it could more actively engage with and even seek to strengthen the BRICS bloc and other non-Western forums, viewing the U.S. as an ultimately unreliable and coercive partner that prioritizes its own unpredictable domestic political agenda over the stability and trust required for genuine strategic alliances.
What would that mean for the global order?
This would signal a truly profound shift in the Indo-Pacific balance of power, fundamentally altering the geopolitical landscape. It would lead to a more explicitly multipolar world where U.S. influence is clearly diminished and new axes of power emerge, potentially with India playing a more central role in shaping a non-Western-centric global order. This scenario would dramatically accelerate the fragmentation of the current international system, with long-term consequences for global security arrangements, international economic flows, and the very nature of international cooperation. It could usher in an era of more fluid, transactional, and frankly, less trust-based international relations globally.
Three very distinct and frankly quite sobering potential futures stemming from this one trade dispute. It really underscores the stakes. So as we wrap up this deep dive, a final thought for you, our listener, to mull over. After hearing all this, what stands out to you about this incredibly complex web of trade, geopolitics, and trust?
Yeah, it's a lot to process, but perhaps the core takeaway, the stark reminder from this crisis is this. In our increasingly multipolar world, the temptation for great powers to use economic coercion, especially against strategic partners, can have profound, unpredictable, and often deeply unintended consequences that reverberate right across the global stage. It really forces us to ask, how do policymakers in Washington, in New Delhi, and elsewhere truly weigh the potential short-term political or economic gains of such actions maybe appealing to a domestic base, or punishing a specific behavior they dislike against the very real long-term risk of alienating key allies, undermining carefully built trust, and inadvertently strengthening their primary geopolitical rivals? And maybe the bigger question for the future, how might disputes like this one fundamentally redefine the nature of alliances in the 21st century? Will partnerships become more transactional, less based on shared values, and more contingent on immediate interests? And how will this shape the emerging global power dynamics as nations like India forge new paths and reconsider long-held strategic calculations? Lots to think about.